All right, so we got a couple Hey Joe questions about this. I feel like we can devote an entire segment to this because there's a lot to unpack. So this is from the Tampa Bay Times. One of their reporters, Matt Baker, was at a Board of Trustees meeting for Florida State. And at the athletic director, his name is Michael Alford, and he said, at the end of the day, Florida State, to compete nationally, something has to change going forward. He's not saying anything that ADs in the ACC haven't said. There's a revenue gap between the ACC and the Big Ten and the SEC. How do you close that gap? Well, that's Jim Phillips' problem, okay? Sell NFTs. I have no idea. So Alford pointed out that Florida State contributes roughly 15% of the value in the ACC's media rights deal, but the Seminoles get 7% of the distributions as one of the full 14 members of the conference. Brian, I know you've talked to ADs about this. There are conversations taking place about reworking how distribution in the ACC operates, because right now it's even.
Right, and that 7% is effectively 100 divided by 15.
Yes.
I've talked to Jim Phillips about this. Bubba Cunningham is on the committee in October, said they'd been meeting for several months to talk about unequal revenue distribution. We could talk about whether or not that's a good idea, but those conversations have been ongoing with ADs in the conference since at least October. Mm-hmm. Now we're in March. That's 7 months later. I get the sense that if you look at the comments that the Florida State AD made, that maybe we're getting close to a decision on unequal revenue distribution.
I think it's a bad idea.
I think it's a bad idea.
You got to remember that the Big East imploded, and a good chunk of the schools that we have in the ACC are here because the Big East had uneven revenue distribution.
The Big 12 never was able to get over the fact that Texas and Oklahoma got paid more money.
Texas got its own network, which nobody watches, and it still didn't keep the Big 12 together. Okay,
that's the biggest problem with unequal revenue distribution. So you give Florida State $5 million more a year.
What does that get you?
Right, they're still leaving at the first chance they get.
Yeah, and they still might not be that good, because that's another issue with Texas. Texas had all the money in the world, their own network. How good have they been? Which I get why you want to close the revenue gap, but the revenue gap is not the reason why you suck. The reason why you suck is because you've made consistent errors in judgment with who you've hired and how you've gone about running your athletic department.
The other question, Florida State, or say they go to the SEC, don't they lose something going to the SEC? Sure, you have as much money as everybody else. You got $75 million in TV money, whatever.
Yeah.
Are you still Florida State if you're finishing 6th in the SEC?
Well, to use my corporate speak here, let's put a pin in that in terms of what are you getting? What happens to you, right? So Florida State's AD was asked point blank by a trustee about a possible buyout for Florida State if they wanted to leave the SEC, the ACC, and go to wherever they wanted to go. And the answer was roughly $120 million. So this was the question. If Florida State could make up $30 million per year, a trustee asked, does that mean the Seminoles would break even in about 4 years? And Alford, the AD, said, hypothetically, yes. Okay, cool. Cool.
Hypothetically, he's doing a lot of work there.
It really is doing some work, because the buyout is not the problem. This isn't when Maryland left the ACC and they negotiated a buyout down to whatever it was. The ACC will gladly take your buyout attempt because the grant of rights holds your television rights through 2036. This is not similar to what happened in the Big 12 and the SEC, because the Big 12's media rights deal was bumping up towards its end when Oklahoma and Texas decided to jump for the SEC. They've negotiated it a year earlier, but you have to remember where they were in their contract cycle for this to work and where the break-even point made sense for these schools, which gets us to, okay, I'm not saying the ACC isn't going to break up. I'm not saying the ACC won't have an exodus. But it's not going to happen until the next round of television negotiations opens up, which, if I know my math correctly, the Big Ten is the one that would come up first. They would be the ones who are interested in schools like North Carolina and Virginia, maybe even Georgia Tech, but certainly North Carolina and Virginia. I would argue that the Big Ten, because of basketball and the totality of what it means, they would actually make North Carolina and Duke a package deal. But we're talking, 2030 before that actually happens?
Right. I mean, they would have to be putting their TV... And they... look, the way the Big Ten's been signing these short-term deals, they could sign another short-term deal and hit 2036, and 2036 is when they go after all the ACC schools.
Entirely possible.
I mean, they don't need – what's going to happen in 2030 is the ACC is going to fall even further behind, and that's when the schools in the ACC are going to get really desperate. But you know, to Florida State's point, I've talked to TV people who say – Florida State, we hear all the time, the ACC has a terrible TV deal. The ACC has a terrible TV deal. I've talked to people who say the ACC has a terrible TV deal for 4 schools.
Sure.
Miami, Clemson, Florida State, and North Carolina. They have an okay TV deal for 2 schools, NC State and Virginia Tech. And the other schools
love it.
Should be, you know, thanking God every day that they have the TV deal that they have. Look what's happening in the Pac-12, where they may have to sell over the air
to Ion
or go on to Apple, and no one will ever watch them again. And the reason I mention that is because that sets up the dynamic for what's about to happen. If you have a life raft, if you're a team that could get a life raft, and that life raft may be for a Pittsburgh to go to the Big 12 and say, look, well, I'll take the stability of the Big 12 over what may happen to the ACC.
Yeah.
That 2030 that you pointed out is going to be a really interesting time where schools say, what does the future look like, and where is the safest place for me to get to?
And the last point we'll make on this is you also get into state politics when it comes to the breakup of a conference. You'll remember that Virginia Tech is in the ACC because of Virginia politics. Things like expansion would not be voted on by Virginia if Virginia Tech was not included. Can't forget that. And we talked to Holden Thorpe, former chancellor at North Carolina, about the time that, you know, the SEC, and they had conversations, you know, if things were to break up, you know, where would we go? And he said, yeah, the SEC would gladly take us. The Big Ten would gladly take us, especially considering that what is valuable to the conferences today. It's not your geographic footprint. It's your brand. The brand matters. And right now, North Carolina has one of the biggest brands left on the table. So the issue for North Carolina, and this is where I have to remind people, and Brian, here's where you can come in and remind people what politics is like, because you're over at the NCGA plenty. Let's say North Carolina has a landing spot. They're going to go to the SEC or the Big Ten. It ain't happening unless you can guarantee that NC State also has a landing spot. Not necessarily a package deal with North Carolina to go to the SEC or the Big Ten, but NC State has to have a place and not be left behind for anybody in this state to sign off on that.
We saw that with Cal, right? Cal is going to get money from UCLA going to the Big Ten. On the other hand, we saw Oklahoma be able to leave Oklahoma State behind and go to the SEC. Now, Oklahoma State's in a fine spot. They're not struggling.
They're not struggling.
That issue is going to be a huge issue because there are plenty of look, I cover a lot of the
I would also point out that NC State and Carolina dynamics are a little bit pettier than Oklahoma and Oklahoma State.
And there's a lot of powerful people in the state with a lot of ties to North Carolina State. That will not be an easy conversation for anybody.
No, it will not.
And I don't know, like in the old days, right? In the old cable subscriber days of conference expansion, the SEC would say, we'll take Virginia Tech and NC State.
Easy.
Gets us in 2 new markets.
Yep.
Look at all those cable subscribers. We're golden. Those are 2 schools that care a lot about football, and they won't disrupt the power, right?
Yeah.
They'll upset somebody here or there, but they won't disrupt the power.
Yeah, they'll just be like, hey, we got more Mississippi States and Arkansas. It's cool.
But we're getting all this extra TV money. Awesome.
Yeah.
That's not the world we live in anymore. If the SEC expands, they're going to go for people that can draw $3 and $4 million viewers on television.